Now it's time for the last word with Lawrence O'Donnell. Good evening, Lawrence. Happy Friday Eve.
Yeah, my Friday. Yeah. Well, this is actually my Friday. In Vegas, Rachel, where people are on, weird work schedules, one of the phrases you can hear on Tuesday is, "This is my Friday."
Yes.
Or Wednesday, "This is my Friday." So, welcome to my Friday. This is on, we have Ambassador Bob Rae, the Canadian ambassador to the United Nations, joining us tonight for the View from the North.
Nice.
I'll see if I can make this trade war any worse by what happens here in the next hour. We'll see.
I could still remember going to visit my uncles in Canada, and when I was a little kid, and seeing my mom, for the only time in my life I've ever seen this, seeing my mom carrying 2 handles of whiskey with her as we were getting there to bring them what they wanted. And we are close. We are very, very close countries, divided at this point by an ethical government. I'll be very interested to hear what he has to say.
We happen to be the country that has the best possible neighboring country on the planet, Canada, and that's the one you aim at.
Yeah, as Justin Trudeau said this week, make it make sense.
Yeah,
exactly.
We will try. Lawrence. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you. Well, today, Donald Trump backed down again. Donald Trump backed down again, and that came 24 hours after the last time Donald Trump backed down on the same subject, his illegal tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico. Once again today, Donald Trump's boss told him what to do, and he did it. Donald Trump's boss is, of course, the stock market. The crashing stock market yesterday, in effect, ordered Donald Trump to drop his illegal and economically illiterate tariff scheme against Canada and Mexico. And so Donald Trump dropped the stupidest part of his stupid idea yesterday, the tariffs on American cars that are actually manufactured largely in the United States, but in the course of their manufacture, they cross the borders of Canada and Mexico more than once before that finished car or truck ends up in your local showroom here in the United States. Donald Trump's illegal and irrational tariff scheme would have added $20,000 to the price of a Dodge Ram pickup truck. It would be the single biggest inflationary act ever committed knowingly by a president of the United States, raising prices by 25% by a Trump edict. It is an order, in effect, to raise prices. The stock market rightly panicked over that prospect, which includes predictions not just of a Trump recession, but in the Wall Street Journal, predictions of a Great Depression caused by Donald Trump's tariffs. The misguided tariff scheme pushed into law 100 years ago by Republican Senator Smoot and Republican Congressman Hawley, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, were the proximate cause of America's Great Depression of the 1930s. Those tariffs were not President Herbert Hoover's idea, but he did sign them into law, and that went a long way to making him a one-term president driven out of office by the governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who then led the country out of the Republican-created depression. With the stock market crashing again today, Donald Trump announced that what he lyingly called a pause of the implementation of some of his illegal tariffs against Canada and Mexico for 1 month, his standard pause period. That is the second month of pausing Donald Trump has done with his own disastrously bad idea. And when Donald Trump has an idea that he really believes in, like closing down all humanitarian assistance by the government of the United States anywhere in the world, he does it immediately. Take food out of the mouths of starving babies in the middle of a famine in Sudan. Donald Trump does that on the spot, no pause. Donald Trump has issued no pause in Elon Musk's complete destruction of the United States Agency for International Development, which, among other things, is the biggest feeder of starving babies in famine in the world. The biggest feeder of starving people of all ages in the world. There was no pause in what Elon Musk desperately wanted to do to those starving children. No pause at all. Because Donald Trump and Elon Musk firmly believe that we must never feed the starving children of the world, never. And Donald Trump and Elon Musk don't even have to think about it. And they know that the stock market doesn't care about starving babies in Sudan or anywhere else on the planet. And so we know just how much Donald Trump does not pause, never pauses when he confidently launches into a Trump idea, no matter how cruel, vicious, and unprecedented that idea is, like taking HIV medication away from people whose lives depend on that. Elon Musk and Donald Trump did that without hesitation, without pause. So when Donald Trump pauses for 30 days, that's Donald Trump publicly confessing, this is such a bad idea, even I can't do it. In the middle of a stock market crash today, Donald Trump's Treasury Secretary appeared in the city that houses the stock market, a city where a dozen eggs now cost $10, and he said, and I quote, "I'm not worried about inflation." After the first Trump presidency, I thought it was going to be difficult to find a Treasury Secretary more ill-suited to the job than Donald Trump's first Treasury Secretary, but he's done it. He's done it again. With inflation up, with Donald Trump threatening the most inflationary tariffs in history, and with eggs going over $10 a dozen in the city where he was speaking today, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said, "I'm not worried about inflation." Imagine if Joe Biden's Treasury Secretary had ever said, under any circumstances, "I'm not worried about inflation," when eggs were half the price that they are today, and less than that. Donald Trump's Treasury Secretary also said today in New York City, in a failed attempt to defend the Trump tariffs, quote, "Access to cheap goods is not the essence of the American dream." Again, imagine Joe Biden or any Biden administration official had ever said, low prices aren't a big deal. Who cares about low prices? That's what Donald Trump's ultra-rich Treasury Secretary said today in New York City. Meanwhile, in the Oval Office, Donald Trump proved once again that no one has the power to humiliate Donald Trump quite like Donald Trump.
Have you been influenced, some of these exemptions that have been announced and some of these temporary delays, have you been influenced in those decisions because of the market reaction?
Well, there were no delays at all. No, nothing to do with the market. I'm not even looking at the market.
I'm not even looking at the market. Donald Trump said that. Donald Trump, the president most obsessed with the stock market in presidential history, tells you the lie right to your face. I'm not even looking at the market. The market is Donald Trump's boss. If you watch the stock market during Donald Trump's tariff games, you know exactly what's going to happen next. Here's Donald Trump humiliating today's Donald Trump, who told the lie, I'm not even looking at the market.
So I won the election. The markets went up thousands of points. Things started happening. You started doing things that you would have never, even though I didn't get sworn in until January 20th. But they refused to do that. And let me tell you, if for some reason I wouldn't have won the election, these markets would have crashed.
And here's Donald Trump 3 weeks ago, humiliating Donald Trump today.
I think the stock market's going to be great. In other words, we will rapidly grow our economy by dramatically shrinking the federal government, that we have to do it.
Yeah, he doesn't care about the market. In an editorial today, the Wall Street Journal picked up on a point that I made here last night in some detail, that the Trump tariffs are, in fact, illegal. The Journal notes that Donald Trump is invoking the 1977 International Emergency Powers Act to justify his tariffs on Canada. But the Journal points out there is nothing happening with Canada that meets the legal definition of an emergency, and there is nothing in that law that specifically authorizes the president to impose tariffs in that kind of emergency. The Wall Street Journal notes presidents have used the law to freeze assets of foreign governments and nationals, restrict U.S. companies from doing business with them, limit export of technologies, and ban imports from adversaries. In March 2022, President Biden used the law to ban imports of Russian energy, seafood, and alcoholic beverages, but notably not to impose tariffs. The Wall Street Journal editorial notes that the Trump tariffs against Canada could not survive a legal challenge. There is pre-existing law governing trade among the United States and Canada, and the United States and Mexico. It is the rewritten version of the North American Free Trade Agreement that Donald Trump himself and his team negotiated and signed with Prime Minister Trudeau during the first Trump presidency and with the president of Mexico, which Donald Trump then called the greatest trade deal in history.
For the first time in American history, we have replaced a disastrous trade deal that rewarded outsourcing with a truly fair and reciprocal trade deal that will keep jobs, wealth, and growth right here in America. And in a true sense, it's also a partnership with Mexico and Canada and ourselves against the world. It's really a trade partnership, if you look at it that way. And it's a day of great celebration in all three countries.
So the president who claims to have negotiated the greatest trade deal in history now believes that is a terrible trade deal. And he alone has decided to violate his own trade deal himself. Leading off our discussion tonight, it is an honor to be joined by Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador Bob Rae. He's also the president of the Economic and Social Council for the 2025 session of the United Nations. Ambassador Rae, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lawrence. Good to be with you.
So you negotiated a trade deal, a rewrite of the NAFTA. And by the way, that kind of trade deal should be rewritten every decade, couple of decades or so. Everybody understands that. It was a good time to do it. We knew a lot more about trade among these countries. And it really did seem to be an improvement. I thought it was an improvement. It should be an improvement. Now, the guy you negotiated with violates the trade deal he negotiated with you. What can you possibly do next with someone who behaves like that?
Well, first of all, we're a resilient people, we're a resilient country. So are the Mexicans. We're working with great determination. I think you had part of the Prime Minister's speech yesterday. It's a remarkable time. The Prime Minister is going to be stepping down soon from his post. There'll be a newly elected leader of the Liberal Party, which is the government in power at the moment, on Sunday. So this is really Prime Minister Trudeau's last period in office. And I think his speech yesterday, he showed enormous determination and clarity. And in a speech that he gave and was him speaking to the Canadian people and speaking directly to the president, he indicated that this approach that the president is taking is wrong. It is illegal. And it's also just wrong because it adds costs and prices to everybody in an economy on both sides of the border, in fact, all sides of the border, that has brought huge benefit to our country and to the United States. And it is possible to have a trade agreement that actually allows everyone to do better. And that's what we've discovered, and we've worked at it since the 1980s. So we are going to continue to work with the administration to try to figure out what is it about this agreement that he now finds so offensive, but also to understand that, this is the time for renegotiation is a year from now. 2026 is the statutory time, the time in law when we're supposed to renegotiate the agreement. And we are ready to sit down at any table and negotiate, but we do need to create some sense of certainty and fairness in terms of how we all treat each other. And that, I think, is what's been lost. The statements the president's made about the 51st state, the references to Mr. Trudeau as the governor of Canada, these are not a joke. They never were a joke for me. I always thought they were deeply offensive and really strike at the heart of what it means to be a Canadian in this world. And I think a lot of people in Canada are stunned and then angry. And I think you're seeing that in the streets of Canada today. You're seeing a sense of deep frustration and deep anger. But I think the governments of Canada are going to continue to negotiate in good faith with the United States. And if it means going to a dispute settlement mechanism or to challenging the law in court, if that's what it takes, or we have to do that, that's of course something we can do. But I think above all, what we want to do is reach a fair and reasonable negotiation with the president and with his team. And that's something that we're still very willing to do.
You know, my reading of the market yesterday, and I'm not, reading of the market is always guessing.
Yeah, a little tricky. You get whiplash.
When things got really serious in the stock market, when Prime Minister Trudeau spoke, because the market hadn't heard from him. They knew the Trump game. They'd been through the Trump game before. They didn't believe Trump. They didn't believe Trump when he threatened the tariffs the first time around, and then he paused them, for a month. And they never expected him to impose these tariffs. They expected another pause, and then they went forward. And then they heard from Canada, and they heard a firmness from the Prime Minister that was clear and solid and strong and determined. And that's when the market said, "Oh, this is real. Canada's going to fight back, and Canada has very strong ammunition here."
Well, I mean, first of all, it is the Prime Minister leading the country, but it's also all the premiers
Yes.
working at the provincial level. And we have a highly decentralized federation where the premiers, I was a premier one time many years ago. And so there's a lot of power in the provinces to do stuff as well. And there's a lot of frustration, and it's shared not only geographically across the board in Canada, but it's shared across party lines. We have representatives of several different parties.
This has been unifying.
This has been an incredibly, I wouldn't just say unifying, I would say galvanizing. This is something that is galvanizing our country with enormous determination. And so what the Prime Minister's announced is a series of steps. You do this, we'll do this. And that's painful to do because it hurts us as much as it hurts the people who are being affected. But more importantly, I think the issue for us now is how do we get this thing back on track? What is it that's really behind it? It doesn't seem to be the fentanyl, because Canada's not a huge source of fentanyl. We all agree that we have to take steps to reinforce the border. And that's happening everywhere. And we understand the need to do that. And that's being done. So what is this really about? And it's the sense that this is such a moving target that the Prime Minister, I think he felt, well, we just have to do what we're going to do. And we have to get some clarity from the American government as to what is it going to take for you to understand that we don't accept this. And we have cars and integrated industries you've described. We have resources of all kinds. We have manufacturing all across the country. And it will affect American customers. Potash, for example. We have farmers in the United States, in the Midwest. Planting season, I know it doesn't feel like it today, but planting season is coming. And when it comes, they're going to need a lot of potash. They're going to need a ton of potash. And we have it, and we supply it every year reliably and on good economic terms with no taxes and no tariffs. And the President of the United States is saying, well, there's going to be a tariff on that. I think these are all things that don't make a lot of sense to us. But we're still good faith people. We want to be in a good partnership, and we value the partnership with the United States a great deal. I mean, I grew up in Washington, D.C., and so I know this country pretty well. And I think what's happening is just not right. And I think there's a lot of Canadians who feel the same way and who feel very, very strongly that we've got to find a way to fix this. And we're ready 24 hours to pick up the phone anytime and just sit down and figure out what is it going to take to get us to a longer term negotiating table for 2026. But let's take the uncertainty out of everything. It's not just markets. The most important market is the job market, and it's jobs. It's jobs for people. It's prices for people. And it's these things that create enormous uncertainty and unfairness for citizens on both sides of the border. We should stop this. And we can stop it. We can
Businesses
stop it.
trying to do hiring and hiring planning in environments like this cannot do it. They don't know what the conditions are going to be 30 days from now.
Well, that's the situation with the 30 days. And the reason that even that is troublesome is because, and he knows this, the president knows this, he's an investor.
Are you sure?
Yes, I'm positive. He's an investor. He's a smart investor.
He's ignorant of a lot.
I'm not going to use those words, Lawrence. You're going to.
I know you're not.
You're going to get me deeper into the mire than
I'm going to lean back here. Please proceed.
I just want to say that, you can't make an investment decision if you don't know what the tax regime is, you don't know what the tariff regime is. But you know what? The president knows that. And what troubles Canadians the most, I think, is it looks like what he's trying to do is really weaken our economy as much as he can and use economic force to weaken us. And we're not going to take that lying down. We see that happening. We don't like it. We don't want it to happen. We don't want to be at the 51st state. We want to remain an independent country. We're very proud to be Canadians. We think we have a lot to be proud of, both in our healthcare plans and the steps that we've taken to create a different kind of country north of the border that shares a lot of values and a lot of things with the United States, but still wants to be itself in the world, just like you wanted to be yourself in the world in 1775. That's what we want. We want to do it without a revolution, and we want to do it without coming to any kind of conflict. We want to settle this in a peaceful way, but we're not going to be taken advantage of. And there's a hockey expression we use, which is elbows up, elbows up. And there's a lot of that going on in Canada today. Elbows up. Let's keep sharp here.
Elbows up. Ambassador Bob Rae, cannot thank you enough for joining us tonight. And please make sure Canada knows we here in the United States could not be more grateful for having the best possible neighboring country we could have to our north.
Well, frankly, we feel the same way. I mean, we have had such a great relationship over so many decades, and really ever since wars ended and people figured out how to live together. We've been trading with each other. We've been marrying each other. Mm-hmm. We've been living with each other side by side, cheek by cheek. It's crazy for us to be having this fight, and we want to end it. But it does require the moving target has to sit still for a while, and we have to find out how we can settle this thing. And I hope we can.
Ambassador Rae, thank you so much.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
And coming up this week, a senator rose in the French Senate in Paris to speak in French about Donald Trump and Elon Musk. We will get United States Senator Jon Ossoff's reaction to that next. America's oldest ally, the only one who was with us during the Revolutionary War against the British, is France. America's oldest ally knows that with Donald Trump as president of the United States, there is really no such thing as an ally of the United States, especially when Donald Trump is willing to start a trade war with the best neighboring country in the world, Canada, who is an ally. French Senator Claude Malhuret said, Trump's message is that there is no point in being his ally since he will not defend you. He will impose higher tariffs on you than on his enemies and will threaten to seize your territories while supporting the dictatorships that invade you. Never in history has a U.S. president capitulated to the enemy. Never has any one of them supported an aggressor against an ally. In 1 month, Trump has done more harm to America than in 4 years of his last presidency. We were at war with a dictator. Now we are fighting a dictator backed by a traitor. That is the French view of Donald Trump becoming the first president in history to change sides in a war, switching the United States from support of Ukraine to support of war criminal Vladimir Putin's murderous invasion of Ukraine. Senator Malhuret said this.
L'Europe est à un tournant critique de son histoire. Le bouclier américain se dérobe, l'Ukraine risque d'être abandonnée, la Russie renforcée. Washington est devenu la cour de Néron, un empereur incendiaire, des courtisans soumis et un bouffon sous kétamine chargé de l'épuration de la fonction publique.
For those of you listening on Sirius Radio who couldn't read the subtitles, Senator Malhuret said, Europe is at a critical turning point in its history. The American shield is slipping. Ukraine risks being abandoned. Russia strengthened. Washington has become the court of Nero, an incendiary emperor, submissive courtiers, and a jester high on ketamine in charge of purging the civil service. Joining our discussion now is Senator Jon Ossoff of Georgia. He's a member of the Senate Appropriations Committee and the Senate Intelligence Committee. Senator, thank you very much for joining us tonight. The world has been reeling since that scene in the Oval Office with Donald Trump and J.D. Vance attacking President Zelensky. We heard some of the French view there tonight. What does it mean in the world? What do you think it means in the world now to be an ally of the United States with Donald Trump as president?
Lawrence, good evening, and thank you for having me back on the show. And since that despicable spectacle in the Oval Office with the president and the vice president attempting to publicly humiliate a wartime leader who is seeking to defend his own nation from brutal Russian aggression, and now as we see the United States withholding vital support from Ukraine, exercising brutal leverage over Ukraine that puts Ukrainian service members and civilians' lives at risk, all while there's seemingly no meaningful pressure on Moscow, it leads to the alarm here and abroad that the White House, given its affinity for the Kremlin, is seeking to rush toward a settlement of this conflict on the Kremlin's terms, which may result in Ukraine being a vassal state of Russia and may invite Russia to re-aggress and to continue seeking influence and territory in Eastern Europe.
Senator, we'd like to squeeze in a commercial break here and keep you across that break, because I also want to get into the ever-expanding corruption opportunities that now exist in this Trump-Musk government. We'll get to that when we come back after this break. An American president is not a king. You would think that in the 3rd century of American government, a federal judge would not have to write that sentence, but that is what federal judge Beryl Howell wrote today in a 36-page opinion rebuking Donald Trump's firing of Gwynne Wilcox from the National Labor Relations Board as unlawful and void. The judge wrote, an American president is not a king, not even an elected one, and his power to remove federal officers and honest civil servants like plaintiff is not absolute, but may be constrained in appropriate circumstances, as are present here. Today in Rhode Island, a federal judge, John McConnell, ruled against Donald Trump's administration freezing funding authorized by Congress and already obligated. Writing, the executive's categorical freeze of appropriated and obligated funds fundamentally undermines the distinct constitutional roles of each branch of our government. The interaction of the 3 co-equal branches of government is an intricate, delicate, and sophisticated balance, but it is crucial to our form of constitutional governance, something everyone learned in high school. In court, the Trump Justice Department has defended the unprecedented actions of Elon Musk against lawsuits by claiming that Musk's activities are legal, insisting that Elon Musk is in charge of nothing and has no power at all. The Trump lawyers have told judges, in effect under oath in court, that Elon Musk is just an advisor to Donald Trump. But Donald Trump himself destroyed that position on Tuesday night.
I have created the brand new Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. Perhaps you've heard of it. Perhaps. Which is headed by Elon Musk, who is in the gallery tonight.
Senator Jon Ossoff is back with us. And Senator, as you know, lawyers for plaintiffs in these cases have already updated their filing, saying, quoting what Donald Trump just said there about Elon Musk really being in charge. But the potential and the reality of corruption in the Trump-Musk regime is like nothing we've ever seen before.
Oh, this must be the most pro-corruption administration in the history of the Republic. And just pause and reflect for a moment on the fact that the richest man in the world, who spent $250 million to elect this president, has now been given the keys to the kingdom. The conflicts and cronyism for Trump and Musk and everybody all the way down are stunning. They have suspended enforcement of the law that bans the bribery of foreign officials. They've purged independent inspectors general across the federal government. All of this while intentionally destabilizing our constitutional order through this radical effort to expand the power of the presidency. And when these kinds of things happen in societies, governments can begin to look more like a protection racket where citizens and businesses have to pay tribute and avoid criticism or face retaliation.
Yeah, you're going to be running in this re-election cycle now. Elon Musk is out there, and the way for him to help Donald Trump with his money is to take all that money that he used to elect Donald Trump and use it to defeat you and other Democrats running for Senate. It's a tough state for you to win, Georgia. Are you ready to deal with what's going to be coming at you from Elon Musk and Donald Trump?
Oh, I'm ready, but I'm going to need help from grassroots supporters. And this is the Citizens United decision finally having reached its ultimate, most dangerous conclusion, where there's this armada of billionaires who, on behalf of the President of the United States, are enforcing Republican Party discipline by threatening primaries against any defectors from within the GOP ranks. And then here I am, the only incumbent Democrat running for re-election in a state Trump won, facing down any number of limitlessly wealthy people who will stop at nothing to defeat and destroy me. And I'm asking for the people's help to ensure I win this 2026 re-election fight in a landslide. The only path back from this, folks, is to regain congressional power. We need a winner's mindset. We need to prepare for landslide victory. And I'm asking you to help me at electjohn.com, electjon.com.
You know, I wasn't trying to turn that into a campaign commercial, but what I'm seeing on the Republican side of the Senate and the House is Republicans who are afraid of doing the most reasonable possible things that are conservative because they are afraid of Elon Musk pouring the money in to primary challengers in the Republican Party who will take that nomination away from them, take their office away from them. And I'm wondering what the fear level is on the Democratic side, knowing that Musk is ready to throw his money at you against you in general elections.
I have no fear, only determination to win, given the stakes and the dangerous trajectory that the Republic's on. But the total capitulation by Republicans in the Senate is an extraordinary thing to see. I mean, I know many of these people, and they're my colleagues, and I know that they know that what's happening is wrong, but they walk onto the Senate floor day after day. Some of them look ashamed about it, and they vote aye over and over and over again because they are gripped in the vice of political fear. And historians are going to fill books about the total abdication by this Republican Congress of their independent judgment, their obligations to the Constitution and the nation.
Georgia Senator Jon Ossoff, thank you very much for joining our discussion tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Coming up today, House Democrats heard from witnesses about the Republican Medicaid cuts, which the Republicans in the House of Representatives have already voted for, will hurt people and possibly close down nursing homes, nursing home residents being kicked out of nursing homes because Medicaid is the single biggest payer of nursing homes in America. That's next. Judging by some of the audience response that I saw, some people learned for the first time last night on this program that the primary payer for nursing homes in America is Medicaid. The massive cuts to Medicaid that Republicans in the House of Representatives have already voted for could result in Medicaid patients being kicked out of nursing homes and those nursing homes being forced to close down.
Major providers that provide nursing home care rely pretty much exclusively on Medicaid as one of their primary sources. And so pulling dollars out of the Medicaid program will negatively impact those seniors.
negatively impact those seniors. You might see that negative impact on your local TV news coverage of the oldest people in America being carried out of nursing homes that are closing down if Donald Trump signs those massive Medicaid cuts into law.
I also think in North Carolina that 50% of births are covered by Medicaid. When we think about the importance of a healthy start to life.
Can you just repeat that, Secretary Kinsley?
Yeah. 1 out of 2.
1 out of 2, 50%.
Are covered by Medicaid.
That's the former Secretary of North Carolina Health and Human Services, Cody Kinsley, testifying to a group of Democratic members of the House of Representatives this morning on the impact of the massive Republican budget cuts to Medicaid, the most important medical program in this country for the beginning of life and the end of life.
My name is Chris Dunham, and I am a full-time caregiver for my 16-year-old son, Will, who has complex medical needs. Will's here with me today, as is his mom, my wife, Maggie. We traveled from Feasterville, just north of Philadelphia, because we're gravely concerned about what drastic cuts to Medicaid would mean for Will. At age 5, he was finally diagnosed with FOXG1 syndrome, a rare genetic disorder that causes global developmental delays, neurological problems, and other health issues. Children with FOXG1, lovingly called foxes, need round-the-clock care. The syndrome has a range of severity, and Will falls in the middle. His first symptom was cortical visual impairment, followed shortly by cataracts. He doesn't communicate verbally, uses a wheelchair. Surgically, he's had a feeding tube placed, his cataracts removed, and rods implanted in his back to help correct scoliosis. Like many Americans, our household is a delicate balance of juggling schedules, caregiving needs, and finances. I recently qualified for a stipend as a live-in caregiver through Medicaid. That's made an enormous difference and has enabled us to get mostly out of debt with the exception of our mortgage. We're not wealthy, we're just trying to make it day to day. Medicaid is nothing short of a lifeline for us. With Republicans proposing to slash hundreds of billions of dollars from Medicaid, all to pay for tax cuts for billionaires, our future is now uncertain. These cuts would have devastating consequences for our family. It's also heartbreaking because I've been hopeful that our country was moving forward in recognizing the need to invest in the care economy. The care economy saves lives. Please protect it.
Our next guest, Representative Robin Kelly, invited the testimony of another witness, Christina Otero.
Sadly, William was born with several complications. He's autistic, nonverbal, and was diagnosed with cerebral palsy and hydrocephalus. He also has a shunt implant. Now that shunt aids draining excess fluid from his brain. Dr. Paul Farmer once said, if access to healthcare is considered a human right, who is considered human enough to have that? Is William, my nephew, human enough to have that right? Please don't cut Medicaid.
Joining us now is Representative Robin Kelly, Democrat of Illinois. She's the co-chair of the Democratic Steering and Policy Committee, which held this morning's meeting on the Republican cuts to Medicaid. Thank you very much for joining us, Representative Kelly. One of the powerful things about this meeting today was that it showed what Medicaid really is. I think some people have an old impression of Medicaid as being something that is beneficial, if at all, in their minds, only to people living deeply in poverty. And it has many, many, many more wide-ranging reaches than that.
It definitely does. And we showed everyday, hardworking people that are trying to take care of their families. And the secretary from North Carolina talked about 50% of births that are covered by Medicaid nationally. 40% of births are covered by Medicaid. And we just did the postpartum extension from 60 days to a year of postpartum coverage. Women will lose their lives if we have to cut Medicaid and cut those programs, just like the children that they spoke about today.
You know, people who've been asking Democrats in Congress to do something, I have always felt when you're in the minority and you have extremely limited power, virtually no power in the House of Representatives, on the floor, or anywhere else, this is what you can do, is hold the kind of hearing that the Republicans refuse to hold and hear from the people who the Republicans refuse to admit exist.
Definitely. I mean, we are fighting with one hand behind our back, but we are trying to educate the public and get the word out. It's more than numbers. These are real people that these things are happening to or will happen to, and that's what we want the public to know. And we also want to give the public a voice. I'm glad to see that people are rising up and going to town hall meetings and complaining, but this is what we need them to do, and we feel real stories from real people will help us do that.
Yeah, and I've felt, and I think you do too, that as this reconciliation part of the package comes into view, and we will see exactly what the dollar amount is and what the specificity is on the Medicaid cuts, and they will be massive. And we will see specifically what they cut from Medicare, and that will be massive. We'll see specifically what they cut from Social Security, that there will be a whole new wave coming to Washington, walking through those hallways of people protesting exactly that.
Well, we want people to know also they're lying because they said that, no, it's not going to be in the bill. Well, there's no way you can give $4.5 trillion tax cuts to the well-off and well-connected without cutting deeply into Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. So they're not telling the public the truth.
Representative Robin Kelly, thank you very much for conducting that meeting that you did today.
Thank you.
It was hugely informative, and thank you very much for joining us tonight.
My pleasure.
We'll be right back. Congresswoman Robin Kelly gets tonight's last word.